The great challenge in modern warfare in general, and in the war in Gaza in particular, is not knowing what is one's moral duty, but in fulfilling it. A just war is divided into two distinct categories. A war which one embarks on justly, and a war which one fights justly, classically distinguished as morality in war and morality of war. Morality in war, a just war, is categorized as a war of self-defense. Wars of aggression are fundamentally deemed as immoral. The war in Gaza, which comes after years of missile barrage on southern Israel, clearly falls under the category of a war of self-defense and is thus a legitimate and moral act on the part of Israeli society in general and the Israeli army in particular. The greater difficulty we face in the war in Gaza is not whether the war was just in the first place, but whether we can fight this war justly. Morality in war requires that one make a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Since war is acceptable only out of self-defense, the only ones that one is allowed to direct lethal force against are those who actively engage in threatening you or your society. As a result, it is only combatants which can be targeted and not non-combatants. Non-combatants, civilians, must basically be left alone and must be safe within the context of this war. The great challenge that we face in Gaza in particular is that it is not that we don't know who are the non-combatants, and it's not that we're not able to identify the civilian population. The challenge we face is that it is impossible to surgically attack the combatants alone. When one fights a terror organization which embeds themselves within a civilian population and uses a civilian population as a human shield, it's impossible to surgically attack them alone. And as a result, as we have seen, there are numerous civilian casualties. In many ways, far more than Israel has ever inflicted, and far more than in our own national narrative and our self-perception are really acceptable within the Israeli moral story and moral vision. What then are we to do? There are two different responses to this reality of injustice in war, both of which I believe are fundamentally unacceptable. The first is to declare that we have to forget completely about the issue of morality in war. The only moral responsibility is to ensure that one is fighting a just war, and once one is fighting a just war, one's primary responsibility is to win. The only critical issue is, are you winning or are you not winning? And to win is the moral duty, for the war itself was morally obligatory. Under this criteria, there are no means which are unacceptable. And fundamentally, one removes from the battlefield any moral aspirations and any moral standards. The Israeli army in general rejects this position. And on a deeper level, the essence of our fight against terrorism is a fight against a body of people who don't make this distinction, who target our civilian population. For us to wage a war against terrorists and to emulate them would be in many ways to lose the war. The war that we're fighting for is the war over our home. Our home is not simply a place. Our home is a moral vision of Jews living in the modern world, of a state of Israel living according to the highest standards. For us to wage a war and to remove completely out of our national discourse issues of morality in war would be a complete failure and a denial of the core Jewish and moral principles which lie at the fabric and foundation of Israeli society. The second, however, is equally unacceptable on moral grounds. That position claims that if a just war cannot be fought justly, then the war is fundamentally a non-just war. If you can't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, then you're not allowed to fight that war. The difficulty within this position is that it basically gives terrorists a victory and immunity. If it is a just war, it is a war that must be fought. We have no choice but to fight this war. To claim that you must handcuff our hands and give those who embed themselves in a civilian population immunity would be to fundamentally create a world in which the evil will always prevail and the moral will both have their moral standards, but will not be able to survive. Israel is both a decision of the Jewish people to live according to the highest moral standards, but it is also a decision of the Jewish people to live. It's to embrace life in real bodies, in a real existence, in a real state. Now, this realism doesn't mean that we give up moral aspirations, but it means that we do not aspire to relive the Masada experience of a mass suicide. Our moral obligation, our commitment to life, begins with our own lives. What is hateful unto you, do not do unto others, our tradition teaches us. Morality begins with a respect for your own life. And you don't love and appreciate and value life in general if you don't appreciate your own. We Jews in Israel unequivocally and without any shame declare our life is important. To deny our legitimacy to defend ourselves because of the evil of our enemy would be to decide to commit suicide, and that is not only unacceptable for a modern state, it is both Jewishly and, more significantly, even morally unacceptable. Our task is not to accept either polarity, neither that which rejects morality in war, nor that which allows the standards of morality in war to determine the morality of war. Our task is to ensure that we do everything in our power to limit civilian casualties, that we do everything in our power, even if it endangers our soldiers' lives, to ensure that we do everything that we can do to focus only on combatants whenever that is possible. We must take responsibility, moral responsibility, whenever civilian casualties are inflicted. Moral responsibility means that we must not accept it. We must mourn it. We must take financial and even responsibility to help them and heal them. Civilian casualties are not our enemy. Palestinians are not our enemy. Our goal is to ensure that we can live. The great tragedy that we face is that our moral responsibility to live and our moral responsibility to target combatants alone cannot coexist. That is the great tragedy that terrorism has inflicted upon all of us. We have to choose. We as Jews choose life. But by choosing life, we don't give up our moral standards. We choose life and never remove those moral aspirations from the table. We have to accept the compromise. But by accepting a compromise, one doesn't remove the moral obligation. One just recognizes that one cannot always fulfill it. That is our dilemma. To fight, to live, and to try to live as morally as possible. Is it a difficult task? It is. But that is the deepest meaning of the challenge of modern Israel.